Well, thank you very much, John. My name's Tom Gaze. I'm director of the Rockefeller Institute of Government, and I'm delighted to have you, to welcome you today to Practical Experience with Election Modernization. I'm not going to take much time from John, so who's going to be John Dunne, who's going to be your moderator today. I do want to just say a couple of things. One is I can't imagine a more timely issue. We just so many of you probably voted in the April 19th primary elections here in New York, which was uncharacteristically and actually an interesting election for New York, having and not just because we had 3 New Yorkers, or at least 3 people who claimed they'd be New Yorkers, but there was a lot of money spent and a lot of competition. But if you did vote, you were an unusual New Yorker. I looked at the most recent estimate, and 19.7% of the eligible people in New York State voted in those April 19th primaries, both, when you include both the Democrats and the Republicans. That's not unusual in New York. We have one of the lowest, as some of your speakers today are going to talk about. New York has one of the lowest turnout rates in the United States. Our other state that's represented here has one of the highest. And though there are a lot of factors behind that, whether it be age, education, sometimes race, gender actually is significant as well. Certainly, a lot of the research does suggest that the rules, laws, the facilities that make voting and registration easier or more difficult play a role as well. So it's wonderful to actually have this panel where we actually also bring experts from outside of New York to talk about what might be some opportunities or things that we might change within New York. John Dunne will be your moderator, and he will be introducing the panel. He's senior counsel to Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna here in Albany. He's been a public servant in many different venues from 1990 to 1993. He was Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he headed up the enforcement of all civil rights laws in the United States, including the more, at that time, recently enacted Americans with Disabilities Act. He was also from 1966 to 1989 a senator here in New York, where he was at various times Deputy Majority Leader and Chair of the Judiciary, Environmental Protection, Insurance, and Prisons Committees. And right now, he's chairing the Special Committee on Voter Participation, which, of course, is relevant to our discussion today. So I'm thankful for Senator Dunne. I'm thankful to our participants, and I'm also thankful to our co-sponsors, the New York Voters Coalition, especially Common Cause New York, and the League of Women Voters of New York State. Now, before I turn it over to John, just a couple of requests. If you do ask a question, please wait for I think, Bob, do we have?
Put a mic stand.
Oh, okay, we're going to have a mic stand up here. Please use the mic stand so we can record it. We put these things up on our website. And if you have anything that is likely to go beep, ring, or play Bach cantata, please turn it off right now. Thank you very much. John?
Tom, thank you very much for the invitation, and I want to thank so much, particularly my friend Susan Lerner at Common Cause for sponsoring and spearheading this program today. The only thing you left out in my introduction was that I cast the first vote of my life in the 1952 Republican primary here in New York State, and I've been at it ever since. It's a great career. All of you are familiar with what we're talking about today, and we've been blessed with a panel of experts who have crossed the country in order to enlighten us as to how success can be part of voter participation efforts. I hope all of you will take a copy of this report, which we are very proud of, which did a very comprehensive survey of the challenges here in New York State with regard to hope that we would increase voter participation. But we have men and women here today from Colorado who drafted a very meaningful piece of state legislation, put together a coalition to see that the public as well as the legislature are educated on the problems and some reasonable responses in order to address it, and they have come here to share their experience. They don't need a great introduction. You will find from their official positions and after their presentation that they really know the business. Now, the first one we'll hear from is Matt Crane, who is the clerk and recorder of Arapahoe County in Colorado. He'll be followed by Donetta Davidson. Like myself, she's a has-been. She's a former Secretary of State of Colorado, former chairman. That's all right. We can take it. We've survived this long. And we will hear from Todd Valentine, the co-executive director of the New York State Board of Elections, and we'll be joined also by Dustin Czarny from Syracuse, one of the election commissioners for Onondaga County, and of course Peter Kosinski, who has modestly said, "I'd rather answer questions than anything else." So we'll hear from them. So first, please welcome Matt Crane, who has been there, has done it, and hopefully he can give us some good education with regard to how to do it here.
Maybe just put this here next to you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here today. My name is Matt Crane. I am the clerk and recorder for Arapahoe County. For those of you who don't know Colorado, Arapahoe County is just south of Denver. Our population is about 600,000, and we have about 330,000 active registered voters. So for Colorado, we're a fairly large county. We're the fourth largest county in Colorado. And so it's an honor for us to be here today. We thank you for the invitation to come. Thank you to Susan for being such a fantastic host for us over these couple of days. But it's a fantastic opportunity to come and talk to you all about our model, which has been our election model, which has been a long time in the making. And there's been quite a few steps for us to get here. And so that will be the focus of my presentation this afternoon. And if you have any questions as we go, please let me know. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the Colorado model, this is what our current model looks like. It was based on the legislation, House Bill 1303, that was passed in 2013. All active registered voters in the state of Colorado get a mail ballot beginning 22 days before the election. All counties have vote centers open as well for 2 weeks before each general election and 1 week before each primary. And the number of those vote centers depends on the size of your population, and that graduation is in statute. Each vote center in the state has multiple e-poll books connecting the entire state so that we can tell if Donetta tries to cheat, if she goes into Arapahoe County and then tries to run to Denver County and register there, we'll know that she did that, and we can stop people from doing that kind of thing. And then another part of House Bill 1303 was same-day voter registration. So we had all of this come in at one time. Okay. Previously, before that, Colorado had, in some counties, precinct polling places, and in other counties, vote centers, where instead of having to go to an assigned polling place, you could go to any vote center in the county and cast your vote. So how did we get to our current model? Colorado's always been at the forefront of election innovation, at least going back the last 25 to 30 years. In 1992, Colorado was the second state to adopt early voting. Texas was the first state. In 2002, Colorado moved to no excuse absentee voting. In 2003, Colorado was the first state to implement vote centers. That came out of Larimer County in northern Colorado. In 2005, we implemented permanent mail-in voting, where somebody, if they decided, if they wanted, they could go on the permanent mail-in list and get a ballot without ever having to request it going forward in the mail. And then in 2013, we came to our current model. And as you can see, we started out back in 1992. There was an effort to alleviate lines on Election Day. Everybody knows, and as you all have seen here recently, nobody likes to wait in line to vote, especially for something as important as voting. So we started down a path of what can we do to alleviate that line and offer our voters more choice. So as you can see, we progress here through until we're at our current model. And the next slide will show you how that's affected participation. So if you come back here, and I'm sorry, that's not 1,998, that's 1998. If you'll look here, on 60% of our voters in 1998 went to vote in person at their precinct polling place on Election Day. Okay, the green line is the absentee or mail ballot voting, and the red line is early voting. So you can see, after early voting had been in place for 8 years in 2004, that was the high water mark for earlier voting percentage-wise. Okay, and then in 2002, when we had no excuse absentee voting, you can see what happens on the graph there, what happens there. By far, over the next 12 years, absentee voting, voting by mail, became the preferred method of voting by far for our citizens. So that, again, in 1998, 60% of our people chose to vote in person on Election Day, wherein in 2014, only 5% of our voting population was making that same choice. 95% of our turnout in 2014 was by mail. Okay, so it's very interesting when you look. In 2010, that was in Arapahoe County. That was the last election we did with precinct polling places. In 2011 and 2012 were our first vote center elections in my county. That's an optional part of the statute. That was an optional part of the statute. And then you can see House Bill 1303. But really, when you look at it, even though all active voters get a mail ballot as a result of legislation in 2013, 80% of those who were voting in my county, and it was similar numbers all across the state, were choosing to vote by mail already. So the leap for us then to go and send every voter a mail ballot to start with wasn't that great a leap. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not familiar with the term vote centers.
Sure, absolutely. So everybody's used to their neighborhood precinct polling place, churches, schools, where you're assigned to go to that specific location. So in 2003, the folks in Larimer County, Colorado, thought it would be a great idea to offer more convenience to that part of the process as well. So the idea of a vote center is, if you're a voter in that county, you can go to any one of the locations in that county, not just the one that you're assigned to. So for instance, in 2010, our last precinct polling place election, we had 200 polling places around the county. We had 1,600 election judges and 1,200 voting machines. In our first vote center general election in 2012, we had 32 voting locations. We had only 500 election judges, and we had about 550 machines out. Because if they're all consolidated like that, you don't need the vast amounts of resources that you do for precinct polling places. So not only were vote centers more convenient for our citizens, but we saved a lot of money in that process. We saved by going to vote centers in 2012, we saved almost $300,000 of our election costs that we had spent in 2010. So that was a fantastic move, and our voters, by and large, loved the convenience of it. But when you look at it, even then, we're only talking about less than 20% of our voting population was even choosing to use the vote centers, because at that point 80% had decided they wanted to vote by mail. So the trend in Colorado was very clear in terms of which way our voters wanted to go, which made that part of the legislation very easy to sell and to pass. Okay, let's talk about cost a little bit now. As I said, when we went to vote centers, we ended up saving about $300,000. In our last precinct polling place election in 2010, this is cost per vote per method. So cost per vote for election day, cost per vote early, and cost per vote absentee. The blue is the cost per vote by mail, where in 2010 it was $2.63 per voter. Election day was about $15 per voter, and early voting was about $20 per voter. Now contrast that once we shifted our model to where everybody started with a mail ballot. The mail ballot expense went up just a little bit, just a hair, to $3.24. But the in-person voting went up to over $50 a voter, because there's still a level of effort that you have to put in to be able to provide those services, but so few people are accessing the ballot through in-person voting that it becomes a very expensive way to go. Now, that wasn't a general election, keep in mind. This year, we will have more people go in person. We may go from 5%, maybe closer to 10%. So that number may come down somewhere to between $25 to $30 per voter. But the mail ballot number, it's always somewhere between $2 and $3.50. So when you're looking at, though for Colorado, it's really been nice. You know, every once in a while you come across a public policy where everybody wins. And with our election model and voting by mail, Our voters love it because it's very convenient. They get their ballot, they can mark it at home. The only thing we ask them is they don't use it as a placemat during dinner because we don't like spaghetti going through our scanners. But other than that, they love that convenience of it, and it is by far the most cost-effective voting model that's out there. So as I said, every once in a while, it's nice when you can find something that's a win for our citizens, and that also happens to be the most cost-effective way for government to operate. So when we look at the national trends of early voting, I got this graph from the National Council of State Legislatures. There are 37 states right now that have early voting. The orange up here denotes states that are all mail. Now, this is a little misleading because in Colorado, we don't really consider ourselves all mail. We have mail ballot delivery to all active voters, but when you still have to have the number of vote centers we have to have, it's tough to say that we're all mail. The green are states that have early voting and no excuse absentee voting. The blue is just early voting, and then the gray, they have no early voting and and you need an excuse to get an absentee ballot. So you can see the trend across the country is offering voters more choices to access the ballot. Okay, the trend is very clear when you look nationally. Okay, voters like options. Increased voter convenience, we've heard time and time again, even from people who, when we were discussing this bill, and as it was going through, we heard from people that said, oh, I'm never going to vote by mail. I love to go to the precinct polling place and to see my neighbor. And we would always start off by saying, well, in the last few elections, when 80% were voting by mail, you weren't seeing your neighbor at the polling place. But even those folks who are diehard, I want to go to the polls on election day, now they say, I can't imagine ever going back to not voting by mail. As a matter of fact, the majority of people we have vote on election day now, that 5%, are people who made a mistake on their ballot and they come in to get a new ballot, a replacement ballot, and they end up just voting while they're there in the polling place. So those aren't, that 5% isn't all necessarily people that were just, dedicated to voting in person. A lot of them made a mistake and needed to come in to fix their ballot. Shorter wait times on election day. In 2010, the last gubernatorial election, which was the last like election for 2014, at some of our precinct polling places, we had lines of over an hour to an hour and a half. In 2014, our longest line was 10 minutes. So, which isn't too bad. I think any of us at this point would take that kind of result. No single point of failure. This is a big thing when we're looking at options for voters. So there's one thing about convenience for voters. The other thing is for policymakers and for people who have to implement these laws. It's nice to have redundancies. It's nice to provide lots of options. So if you have something where there's a bad weather event, like Hurricane Katrina or anything like that, that's not the voters have other options besides going on election day. That's so very important. It provides much greater access to the ballot, which is our goal as election administrators. The one thing we want to do is make sure that voting is as easy and accessible as possible. One of the things that we're really proud of that came out of our law in 2013, far fewer provisional ballots. Now, for those of you who don't know provisional ballots, when somebody comes into a polling place or a vote center and their eligibility is in question, if they're not in the poll book, or in Colorado, if they don't have the right type of ID, something like that, then they'll be given a provisional ballot where it will be looked at later after Election Day by a bipartisan team of election judges to decide whether or not that person is eligible and if that vote should count. So in Arapahoe County in 2012 and in 2010, actually, we had similar numbers, right under 6,000 provisional ballots that we accepted. In 2014, that was down to 101. So there were, in 10 and 12, we had about 7,000 cast overall provisional ballots, and in 14, we had just 200. So a lot of those issues that people had were mitigated by the changes that we had in our law, it's a win for everybody. It's greater access. Nobody has to worry about, oh my gosh, will my ballot not count because I'm voting provisionally? And whenever you have provisional voters in your polling places, that leads to longer lines because it's a longer transaction to complete. And then finally, when you look at it, citizens always love a government that's fiscally responsible. And as I said earlier, this has been something for us in Colorado that's really a win-win in terms of it's great for the voters, it's good for us as election administrators, and it's certainly good for the state and county budgets where we don't have to spend as much money to conduct these elections. Okay, a couple of other things that we have found and that came up in the course of our conversation over at the Capitol today. I know there's a lot of concern in terms of does one voting method favor one party or another, and what we have found that it does not. Elections are won by who's on the ballot, or in Colorado, issues that are on the ballot. I made a joke earlier today. Colorado is a big initiative state and referendum state, and the turnout is always fantastic when we have weed and taxes on the ballot. So we know that we have to ramp up in those situations. But ballot content is always what affects voter turnout the most. So the model makes it easier for people to vote, but it doesn't necessarily affect turnout very much, and it certainly doesn't favor one party over another. So there's a couple of myths out there that we've, at least in Colorado, been able to debunk just a little bit in terms of it. People love the convenience of what we do, and they certainly love when it's the most cost-effective choice. So with that, if there are any questions. Yes, ma'am?
You had mentioned that some of the people who actually voted in person were people who had been called back because of something was wrong with their ballot or something like that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The two things on that. One, if somebody did spill spaghetti on their ballot, or they mismarked it and accidentally voted for the wrong candidate and decided they spoiled their ballot and they needed to come in and get a new ballot, they could do that. They could do that at our vote centers. And then something else is a part of our mail ballot process that's important to know. One, we check the signature on every single ballot that comes back to us for verification. And if there's a signature issue or discrepancy on that ballot, we'll mail the voter a letter saying that, hey, there was an issue with your signature discrepancy with your ballot. You have until 8 days after the election to come in and cure that discrepancy. So we do everything we can to enfranchise the voter and help them get their vote cast. Yes, ma'am.
Given that you have so... Hi, thank you. Given that you have so many fewer people coming out on election day to the poll sites to vote, do you open up the full complement of your poll sites, or have you reduced the number of sites that you open up on election day?
No, that's a great question. We made a big reduction when we went to vote centers in 12. There is a set amount of vote centers that we have to have. They're now under 1303. They're called voter service and polling centers, which is a mouthful. We still just refer to them as vote centers. But there's a specific floor that we have to have in statute. So in my county, it's 23. So we could have gone down from the 32 we had in 12 to 23. But then we take a look at, and we're still learning, this will be our first presidential going through this model, but we take a look at geography, we take a look at where we think in-person people are going to go, and so we play with that number. So instead of the floor of 23, we're going to have 25 this year to make sure we have adequate coverage.
25 in your entire county?
In my entire county, that's
and
right.
10 years ago, 12 years ago, how many would you have had open?
200.
200.
200, right? Or more. And the early voting also, you need fewer for early voting, so we'll have 11 open by statute. That's the number required by statute for early voting. And then for election day, we'll take that up to 25. And because this is our first time through the model, we think we know what's going to happen, but because it's our first time through, we're actually going to open up the additional vote centers on the Saturday before, because the turnout data, that doesn't change as far as when people vote. It's a very slow buildup. The first week of early voting is very slow. The second week gets much busier. And then the weekend before Election Day, that's when you see the graph really take off. So we're going to open our additional locations on that Saturday before to be able to handle that influx and hopefully encourage people not to come and wait in line on Election Day.
So when you have your early voting, do you have these vote centers open 7 days a week?
We have them open 6 days a week. We don't have them open on Sundays during the statute says reasonable business hours. So in my county, we'll have them open 8 to 5. And then one day each week, the Tuesday of each week, will be open from 10 to 7 to try to help facilitate voting for people that don't get off work until 5 o'clock. So we do everything we can to make it as accessible as possible.
Okay, thank you.
One of the things that is taking place is because of so few people going, and as Matt said, we want to get through the presidential primary before we really, take all of our figures of how many people are taking advantage of those types of polling sites and voting, because we'll probably go back into the legislature and ask for that number to be reduced, because we feel right now we're wasting money, either reduce the time or reduce the number of sites. So that will be figured out out in the future. So we're always tweaking, it seems like, our law and working with it, but you want to make sure you're covered. And so it may say something like the primary, this is the number of sites you need, general, unless it's a presidential general, you need this many sites, and at a presidential, you need to ramp up even for more. As we all know, we get more voters turn out at presidential elections than any other election. So we want to make sure we're covered, and the clerks have the options to add sites as they see as needed. But we probably will go back in for a tweaking of that law.
Yes, ma'am.
Where are these sites? In New York, they're mostly schools and firehouses and churches. But if you're going to be open that amount of time,
Repeat the question.
Sure.
what do you use?
So the question was, what kind of locations do we use? Traditionally, here in New York, I think you said they use schools and fire departments and churches. And so what kind of facilities do we use? That was part of the consideration in the move to vote centers for us, and then ultimately into where we're at now with our current model. It's become tougher and tougher to find locations to be open, let alone open for a period of 2 weeks. Schools now in Colorado, almost no schools will allow voting to take place because they're so concerned about the security. And of course, we understand that, but it creates challenges for us. So we look for other government buildings. We look for recreation centers, churches that have big gyms or big spaces where they'll let us in. And we have a lot of great relationships with churches in our county and across, actually all counties do across the state. So we just look for the best footprint we look for is somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 square feet. And it can be a challenge, but that's also where moving our model towards a mail ballot model, really helps recognize the pragmatic issues we have. It's tough to find locations, and it's tough to find election judges anymore that want to work. It was really hard for us in 2010 to find 1,600 people that wanted to staff our locations. So I think our model does a lot to address that as well. It helps. It understands the issues that we have and helps us work around them.
Yes, if you're going to be universally mailing ballots to every registered voter, it would seem that you need to be really certain of your registration list. Can you tell me what you've done or what you might suggest as far as keeping that up to date, so for people that have moved or died, or how you kind of find out to keep that list current?
Sure. We do a couple of things. First of all, we follow everything that's in the National Voter Registration Act in terms of what's called for there. Our Secretary of State's office gets a list from our Health and Human Services Department that they send out monthly to let us know who's passed away. One of the things about 1303 that has been really good for us in terms of keeping our list clean is it allows us to use the United States Post Office National Change of Address database. So we can take that, and if we get that somebody's moved from that database, we can move them to whatever county they've moved to in our registration system, and the ballot will then follow them to their new county. We'll send a letter to their old address just in case there may have been a mistake, and if they send it back saying I haven't moved, then we just pull them right back over. But we're able to make that change proactively before we contact the voter, and that's really created a lot of efficiencies for us.
That list is done every month. So we don't just do it every 6 months or every year. We do it monthly.
Right.
I have a question. Can I ask a question? Can I do that? Man, I just wanted to clear. I'm not clear how this works. So if I get a mail ballot,
Yes.
you send me my ballot.
Yes.
So I get it at my house, and now I have to deliver it to the Board of Elections. So it comes in an envelope, and then do I mark my ballot, put it back into an envelope, sign the envelope, bring
Yes.
it back to one of these vote centers?
No, actually, it's how you want to return it back to us is up to you. You mark the ballot at home, you put it in the envelope, make sure you sign it. You can either put it in your mailbox at your house and have it mailed back to us. You can bring it into one of our offices, or what we see now across Colorado is a lot of counties are putting up very much like the blue mailboxes. specific 24-hour ballot boxes that are under video surveillance for 24 hours a day during the election. We have 25 of them around Arapahoe County, around my county, we will for this election, where that's the only, they're just for ballot boxes. And so we put them geographically around the county where it makes sense. And people actually love to drop their ballot off much more than mailing it back. Right now, in the last election, we had about 70% who chose to use those 24-hour boxes as opposed to mailing it back through the mail.
Okay. So it comes back to the board then through this process. Now you've got it, and it's coming in early. It's coming in before Election Day.
Yes.
Right along, as I understand it.
Yes.
How early do you send them out?
We send ballots out. We start sending them out 22 days before
22
the
days,
election.
okay.
Right.
So then for like 3 weeks, run up to the election, you're getting
Yes.
ballots back. So the ballots come back, and then you have them in an envelope. Does the board secure them? Does the board open them? What are you doing with that ballot when it comes back?
When it comes back, all of our, we have very specific security requirements around our facilities for where we receive the ballots back to. And then beginning 15 days before the election, we can take the ballot out and start processing it and sending it through the tabulation process. Of course, we don't, we don't hit total on the tabulation machine until 7 o'clock on election night. But doing that allows us to keep up with the influx of ballots as they come in and makes Election Day a lot more manageable.
So you're actually counting ballots then right
Correct.
along during
Correct.
this process?
Beginning 15 days before. Right.
And one of the things I think is important, every day those ballots are counted. They know how many ballots they received. So there's a process of those ballots. And even before they come in, I think it's important that our large county tracks the ballots once it goes to the post office. From that time on, that ballot is being tracked that, okay, it went to the post office, then it was, we have information of when it hit the home address. And then from the home address, we know when it's back at the post office, if it's mailed, and then we know when it received in our office at the county clerk's offices. So, and once it's received in the county clerk's office, then that list is available that the ballots are back in. Whether it's counted or not, that is up, that their ballot is back in, and the parties can have that information of everybody that has cast a ballot so far.
Okay.
And so we track and we keep a very tight security on all of our ballots all the way through the process of counting them, and once it goes in to be counted then, run through the equipment, that total goes in and then is sealed, and we're always under camera and in the clerk's offices with the ballots being returned.
So, Matt, you made reference to this idea that if I want to, I can show up at a vote center on Election Day.
Yes.
And recast a vote. So if I've sent a ballot in through the mail process and now I've changed my mind?
No, so in that case, if you
How does
send
that
it,
happen?
if you send it,
Change your mind?
once you cast your ballot by mail, the statewide voter registration system is updated. So if you tried to go in and cast a ballot in person after that, then you would be turned away or offered a provisional ballot because you wouldn't be able to get your ballot back and then, change how you voted. But if somebody makes a mistake on their ballot, or if somebody decides they just want to vote in person, they can show up. The way our e-poll book looks, it does tell them real time if the ballots come back. So let's just say you just decided you didn't want to vote it and you want to go in. We can see that you haven't returned your ballot yet. We would then let you vote in person at the polling place that day. And then if you try to trick us on the back end and you send your mail ballot back, we'll see when we scan your ballot back in that you voted in person. And so that would prevent the second ballot from counting and going through. And then at that point, your name would be on a list that would go to our district attorney.
Okay. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought I could cast, or I could send it back and then change it.
No, once it's cast, it's cast.
Well, I apologize, but I actually have three questions. One is, you've talked really about the act of voting and making it a lot easier. Could you tell us whether Colorado is working on registration? I know some states are doing automatic registration or even pre-registration for teens. I was wondering whether you would comment on what the state has been doing on that. The other issue, or the other question is evidence. I mean, in terms of effects, have you done any studies analyzing whether these measures making voting easier has had an increase, has produce an increase in turnout? And I guess the last question, really relevant to New York, where we have a lot of elections, especially local elections. Is this done for not just statewide, but also local elections, county, city, here we have school, all kinds of elections. So sorry about having so many, but it's fascinating.
Well, let's see if I can start with the last one first, because my memory can be short, so you may have to remind me. But the last one, our school board elections are odd year, and so that falls in the hands of the county clerk. So yes, they follow everything that we've talked about. The only election really that doesn't fall underneath it is the city elections, because the city elections, they're home rule, and they can decide how they want to run their elections by their codes. But most of them adopt the state law of Title I. But there's a few that do not. But I just so that you know in that one. And they hold their elections at different times than what we hold ours. That they're usually March or April. So that's the case in those elections. And then special districts, they can hold their own election if they choose. But most of them, if it has anything to do with money, it has to be on our November election of each year. So they have to work with the clerks. If it has anything to do raising taxes or lowering taxes or mill levies to, do anything, it goes on our November ballots. So that's the process of the different type of elections. Now, talking about the 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds.
Automatic registration using...
We do not have automatic registration. We do allow for the 16 and 17-year-olds to register, and most of them register at the driver's license facilities, and those registrations come in. So far, Matt would tell you in Arapahoe County, the Republicans are ahead of those that register that way, the young kids. They are put in a holding pattern in our statewide voter registration system, and when they turn 18, then they automatically go on the list that they can vote in that election. And they would be active. That would be their first election. If an individual that, you all know what the difference of active and inactive voters are? Okay, well, it's the same throughout. So you understand that process, so I don't need to go into that. And that's why we only mail to the active, because the inactives a lot of times need to change their address or they have moved out of state. So that's why we only mail to the active in that process with the active and inactive. But that's another area that people come to the polling sites to vote, is because they need to change an address from one county to another, or from, and this way they're getting the correct ballot that they can vote on. They're voting for their House district, Senate district, congressional district, the correct ballot that they need to be voting on. Because before, we said, oh, if you moved within 30 days, you got to go back to your old precinct. Well, then they weren't voting on the correct ballot. And that was a real problem, because they weren't voting where they really lived and voting for their own representation. So we corrected that in this law, and that's one of the things that helped us in correcting it. The middle question, help me.
Yeah, what have you found in terms of effects on turnout, either among registered voters or all eligible voters? Registered voters,
with the process we're using now, is staying basically the same. It hasn't helped one party over another party. Matt, in Arapahoe County?
Or in terms of general numbers of turnout either, it hasn't. It hasn't really changed it.
Right. It's just an ease of how the people are voting, and it has not affected turnout, and it hasn't affected the election process either. And that's one of the things that I think the Republicans have become really more engaged in the law now, and like it a lot better, that they've seen that they didn't lose a lot of elections.
I have a question about the vote centers. Are people assigned to different vote centers, or can you go to any vote center?
You can go to any vote centers, so long as it's in your county, you
Well,
can
that's
go
what
to
I was
any
going to
vote
ask.
center.
Okay,
Right.
so you have to stay within your county, and you can go to any vote center.
Correct.
But what about, or maybe you don't have elections that would be, if a county legislature is by districts or something, how do you make sure that the right ballot, they're getting the right ballot when they go? I mean, is that all electronic as well?
No, that's a great question. So counties do it differently. Some counties will send out every type of ballot style to every vote center so that if somebody from way across the county comes in, they can give them that paper ballot. Other counties are doing ballot on demand. So they have a database of ballots, and it's plugged into the statewide voter registration system. So one of the buttons in the system, I'm really simplifying it here, but it just says print ballot. And then it prints the proper ballot style for that person out of the statewide voter registration system, and that gives it to, and that will give them the right ballot.
I have a quick question about languages, and I guess Spanish would be the primary language besides English in Colorado. Could you talk a little bit about how that impacts, Spanish ballots?
Sure. It's there are only, I think, 4 counties in Colorado that fall under
Yeah.
Section 203. They are all Spanish. But it would work the same way in terms of if somebody requests a Spanish ballot, then they'll have that stock on hand. All right, and actually, no, what happens is I misspoke. The ballots are on both, like Denver County, they're English and Spanish. They have both on the same ballot. And so it's much easier that way.
And in our absentee, one of the things that came up today in the meetings is they felt like the absentee was a paper ballot and had to be counted by hand. Our ballots that we mail out to our voters, and always have been, whether it was absentee or the process we're doing now, that ballot is the very same ballot that the voter is voting on in the polling site, and it runs through a machine. It's not counted by hand. The errors of counting by hand is so great that we always make sure that the ballots are run that way. Then we have a great audit process on that after the election to make sure that, the machines go through all the testing before the election and after the election and everything like that, but we still have an audit of the ballots themselves.
What percentage is that?
Beg your pardon?
What percentage do you use for your
Do you want to explain it?
Sure. We're moving to a new model in Colorado. We've had a very simplistic post-election audit for some time. We're moving now to risk-limiting audits. And so the amount of ballots to audit, and it was created, the risk-limiting was created, or at least the form that we're looking at was created by Philip Stark, who is out at Cal Berkeley, a scientist out at Cal Berkeley. And what you do in that case is it depends, how many ballots you audit depends on the margin of victory. Because really, you're not verifying the exact vote total with a risk-limiting audit. You're verifying that the right person won. And that's the way that it's designed to audit. And so if you have a wider vote margin between the two candidates, then you don't have to audit as many ballots because the odds that there was a mistake are much smaller. Whereas if you have a very close election, then you're going to have to look at a lot more ballots to make sure that the results are accurate. So on the whole, we think it'll probably save time because most of our contests have a fairly wide margin. We did some pilots with Dr. Stark in 2013, and in 2014 we looked at the governor's race, and we ended up only having to audit, I think, 50 ballots from the governor's race, whereas our old requirement would have been 500 ballots. But because of the statistics involved, we were able to say with, I think, a 95% accuracy rate that the right winner won that election in our county.
So then there would never be a recount?
Well, if you take the risk limiting audit out to its full, if you take that out to its full, you wouldn't need to do a recount because if the race was that close, you may almost get to every ballot anyway. So the need for a recount could conceivably go away. Now, I'm not suggesting that or saying that'll ever happen, but certainly risk limiting audit could do away with a recount.
Have you noticed whether there's any differences with urban, rural, or suburban settings of the use of vote centers versus on election day versus mail-in ballots, or is this I mean, I know I saw Arapahoe County is very high at mail-in ballots, but is that typical of every county, or do more urban counties have more election day, the election day voting as opposed to mail-in voting?
I think the percentages statewide are very much the same. And Arapahoe County is there's a few counties in the Denver metro area that are pretty unique in that we have a lot of urban areas, but then when you go out to the plains, we're 77 miles long, so we have a lot of agricultural land out there too, and the trends are all the same. People love to vote by mail, and they'll go to an in-person place if they made a mistake or if you drag them kicking and screaming, but otherwise, they love to vote that mail ballot.
And on your mail ballots, how do you address accessibility issues?
So with the mail ballot, that's part of the reason why we have so many voter service and polling centers, because if there is a voter who has an accessibility issue and they need to use an accessible device, they can come in and use that accessible device in our vote centers. So our ballots, I'm not sure of any way to make a mail ballot fully accessible like that, that's one of the big reasons why we still have so many vote centers.
And I can add to that, our accessibility committee and the people that's been involved with this, they love the new process. Some of them, unless it's sight, they feel they can vote that ballot at home and want to, but if they need the equipment, they feel like they've got the opportunity for that 2 weeks before a general election to go and vote. And they like that. If they go downtown to get groceries or something and be able to stop by one of the sites and be able to vote, they love that opportunity. I don't have to do it one certain day that I may not feel as well as I do right now.
I mean, just on that single day issue to offer that, I mean, one of the differences clearly when you look at the map showing the early voting or the no excuse absentee, and the green to orange was more on the western side of the state versus the more traditional side on the eastern side. I mean, there is a historic difference between, and certainly geographic difference between that part of the country and the eastern part of the country, where our history for the culture has developed around the voting day as a community day, as a day to come together. That's how it's treated that way, but if do you find that there's any issue now having spread out election day over a 3-week period, basically, that there's a loss of community, or do you see any type of an impact because those last weeks of a campaign can be critical, as we've seen in many campaigns recently, those last few days, is there any issue that you see coming up that's impacted by stretching out election day over a 3-week period?
No, this question came up earlier today, and there are definitely voters that are concerned about the October surprise that comes out the last weekend before. But that's the great thing about our model, is that it's the voter's choice. And so if they're willing to take that risk and they want to turn their ballot in 2 weeks early, then they do that. But by and large, the majority of people do wait until the last 3 or 4 days to bring their ballot back. But having that choice there it puts that in their hands, which is nice. In terms of the idea of community, we've heard that as we've gone and spread things out a little bit. But as I mentioned, the people that were hardcore, my father, I love going to the poll. I love doing this. He's 89 years old. From New York, not from Long Island. So the whole idea. It's not a bad. No, it's not. No, and my mom's from Brooklyn too, so that gives me a little more cred with the audience. But as they get used to the new model and the new methods, nobody likes to go wait in line. And my dad says, well, heck, I can have my the neighbor over for a drink anytime I want to. And I think when you look at the turnout trends in Colorado, how Colorado does, we constantly rate in the top 5 in terms of voter participation nationwide. And so I think that our people have adapted to these changes, and they love them. And by and large, this is the way that they like to go. Especially, and I'm sorry, Donetta, especially the younger voters too, because the questions that's over here. The question we get from the younger voters is, when can I do it on my phone? Which I'm not here advocating that at all, but and so that's where it is now, and so it's been interesting. That definitely was something at the start, but as we've gone through, it's kind of gone away.
Yeah, and I agree with Matt. As the people decided, gosh, we can play cards and have our friends in, but one of the biggest things that we saw, Todd, is the mistakes that was being made because they were visiting with their neighbors, and especially in more the rural. And as you probably know, I started out as a county clerk in a very rural area, and only had 5 precincts in the whole county. So you can see that it was very rural. And the mistakes that those people made at the precinct, because they were visiting with their neighbors, got to adding up. And so our mistakes have gone way down. It's amazing because that type of thing. But the voters have really liked going to this method because it's like, gosh, we have the basketball, the football games, and things like that where we really enjoy visiting with our neighbors and have them over, and that's when we really can enjoy them. So the community thing has been, we don't even hear about it anymore.
When they return the ballot, is there a stamp or somehow postage paid already, prepaid, or do they have to find a stamp? A lot of people don't have stamps nowadays.
Right, they do. Colorado doesn't cover postage on ballots. We just had a bill like that run through the legislature to provide prepaid postage. But again, using my county as an example, to me, it seemed like a solution in search of a problem. In 2014, we had to color. If you don't put a stamp on it, counties will still cover it because we don't want somebody's ballot rejected because of that. But in 2014, we paid less than $200 in unpaid or improper postage. So it's not a big issue. And then when you couple that with the drop boxes that we put around the county, if you don't want to spend the money, you don't have to. You can just go and drop it off. It's really not an issue for us.
So do I understand correctly that a voter who moves from one county to another is still eligible to vote in the election? They're still registered?
That is correct.
I like that.
I
think the voters would like that.
We have a live voter registration system at the Secretary of State's office. And when you change your address, it goes up to that system immediately. And that way, you're voting in your new county. When you cast that ballot and change your address, you will not be able to vote in your old one.
Right. Even if you've been issued a mail ballot, which happens quite often if somebody moves after ballots have been mailed, let's say somebody is in Denver County and they come to Arapahoe County, as soon as we pull them into Arapahoe County, if that ballot hasn't been voted yet, then it's canceled in the system. If it has been voted, then that's noted so that we know not to send them a ballot and not to issue them a ballot.
Okay. And I have a comment about turnout. In Columbia County, and I'm the Democratic Election Commissioner in Columbia County, in the presidential primary, we had very good turnout. We had 52% Democratic turnout, and we had 40% Republican turnout. And I can't tell you what the turnout was for all the independents that try to vote by affidavit ballot, but we had good turnout. And I think I understand correctly that turnout upstate tends to be higher than it does downstate. Is that accurate? I mean, you're talking about statewide turnout being very, very low, but upstate, isn't it higher?
Upstate's better than, say, New York City in particular.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
I got another question while the microphone's being passed. I think while in New York, our experience with paper ballots, absentee ballots, are that we get them and then we wait until after Election Day and we open them up with a bipartisan team, and that in a close election, people can come in and challenge those absentee ballots. How do you handle challenging mail-in ballots? Is there an opportunity for campaigns to come in and peruse those mail-in ballots to make sure that they're accurately being handled?
Absolutely. Each candidate and each party can assign watchers to each step of our ballot process. So from when ballots come in the door to where we send them through signature verification to ballot opening to tabulation. And there is a mechanism if they see anything that they think is out of line where they can let us know. We'll stop the process. And there's an appeal process all the way up to the Secretary of State's office if it needs to go that far. But we try to be as transparent as possible. When a watcher comes in, we walk them through the entire process process to educate them, because that's a big problem if you get people in who don't know the process. And then once they're educated and they follow along, it usually works pretty well.
Cameras.
And we do have cameras in there too, watching, absolutely.
Even when the judges are verifying the signature, that there's a team, Republican, Democrat, verifying that signature. The signature that's on the website is up on a camera up at the top of his office wall on each station, and they can see the signature of the ballot and the signature that's on file.
Right.
And they can see if that matches in their own mind.
So that process is extended as well.
That's correct.
So it's not just an after-election process?
No, 15 days before the election. Well, especially in general, in smaller elections, we don't need as much time, but for the presidential this year, we start that 15 days before. We work with our partisan candidates so they know this is when we're kicking it off, and they're always welcome to have watchers there. And it's interesting, and we don't typically have a lot of watchers until after Election Day if a race is close.
Okay. So
And then they'll come in and they'll watch that process, but we set up screens so that they can see everything very clearly, and if they have an issue, we'll stop the process, we'll talk it over with them, and usually everything is resolved well.
Hi, can I ask about what you do for military? You're not,
Sure.
Aurora doesn't, at Lowry.
We do at Buckley.
Yes.
Buckley's out
Buckley
there as well.
Field.
Right.
And the Air Force Academy, which
Spent
is,
some time in Colorado.
I was stationed there for
we
2
have a
years.
high
Oh, very
number.
good, very good. So we follow in Colorado, we follow all the federal requirements around the UOCAVA, which is the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Voting Rights Act. We send ballots out to our UOCAVA voters 45 days before, at least 45 days before Election Day. Some of those ballots are electronic ballots that they can vote and send back electronically. And then in Colorado, we've also extended the process a little bit as well to where we will accept those ballots back up until 8 days after the election, so long as they are postmarked by Election Day, because we want to make sure we're giving our military every opportunity to get that ballot back on time. And so we do get a lot that come back after Election Day and have been postmarked, and that process has worked very well for us. Yes, sir.
How does that work for college? How does that work for college students as well? If they living in a college dormitory or even an apartment near the university?
So generally, if they're just on the regular mail ballot list, then they would fall under the same guidelines as all of our non-UOCAVA voters. So their ballot has to be back in our office no later than 7 o'clock. Postmark does not count.
But if they want to vote, let's say at the university where they're...
Oh, if they want to vote at the university? So that would mean that they want to change their residence from Arapahoe County to, let's say, Boulder, where we have the University of Colorado. If they make that decision, then they could just go into a vote center on Election Day, change their registration to Boulder County, and then vote a Boulder County ballot.
I have a couple
Their
of...
parents tried to vote their ballot for them,
Which happens.
and we have had that
That
happen.
happens.
They try to vote that ballot and send it in. Well, their signature doesn't match, number one, and so we send them a letter. Well, they don't come in, but that is sent on to the DA. And we had a very prominent, with one party, vote their son's ballot, and it was sent to the DA. And of course, when the DA called, they were not happy. They called the clerk's office, and we said, well, you broke the law. Sorry, but you broke the law. And so people are learning you can't vote your kids' ballot, and whether they voted at a college or not, you still can't vote their ballot.
And that is one thing, just so you all know, around the signature verification process, because that's a big thing, especially among Republicans in Colorado who have great concern about mail ballot and fraud. The signature verification piece is the single greatest piece we have of integrity around the mail ballot process, and it's something we take very seriously. So in Colorado, we hire signature experts, forensic experts to come in and train our election judges on what to look for to tell if a signature is valid. A lot of counties now, my county, we use electronic signature verification software as a first check. So it's the same kind of software that banks use and other industries use who want to maintain high security around signatures. So we put a lot of time and effort into the training and operation of the signature requirement, and it is extremely difficult to cheat, to get anything past that. So we spent a lot of time to make sure that the process is as secure as possible.
I think one of the things I'd like to add while you're getting the mic to somebody is we would not sit here and advocate that you jump in and do everything that Colorado's doing immediately. You know, you've got to make sure your statewide voter registration is really in good shape, and it may be. But you've got to make sure that it's really very accurate and very in good shape before you do same-day registration, for instance. And if you know, it takes training for your election officials in their offices, the county clerk's office, or do you call them county clerks? You don't.
Board of Elections?
Board of Elections.
Board of Elections.
For the Board of Elections even to get used to new laws. So you don't, you know, sometimes jumping in and doing everything at once is very difficult. So we took it step by step, and I think that's why we were more successful. Did we lay out a plan to do this and have a goal? No, it just happened that way. So it's, you know, it's kind of nice. You hear something like this, you think, get all excited, but it's important you start these steps, I guess is where we're coming from. Start it, decide how you want to start it, working with it, you know, like your electronic poll book. I think it's important for Matt to talk about our electronic poll books and how we've saved money by doing it. You don't buy poll books, buy the laptops for everybody. Go ahead, Matt. I'm taking your thunder.
What we found, you know, because especially there is going to be an investment of money. There's no question, but you'll make up that money in terms of on the back end processes become faster. You need fewer people. But one of the things we looked at with the poll books, do we buy the computers for that or tablets for it? We used laptops in Arapahoe County. Do we buy those? But if we bought them, then we have to worry about maintenance on them, storage on them, all those kinds of things, aside from just the cost of it. So what we found was leasing was a much better option. You don't need space to storage. You don't have to do any maintenance on it between elections. And when you lease in bulk like that, you get fantastic deals. So I think we spent around $40 a laptop in 2014. And so there's ways, even though for some of these things, for like early voting, you are going to have to spend some money if you decide to implement early voting. There are ways that you can do that in a very cost-effective manner that your citizens, the end result is that your citizens will love it. It'll be less wait time. And you'll start to realize that you can save money over the long haul from after you make the initial purchase or lease.
Well, I'm glad you brought up electronic poll books because my county actually did a pilot recently on electronic poll books, and we're still waiting for the legislature to implement that as a possibility for counties across New York State. Right now, we're still on our old printed ballots, and I think that's one of the reasons why we have the large registration deadlines that, you know, that are for, because a lot of our counties are going out to outside printers to print up our poll books. But we did a pilot on electronic poll books in Onondaga County, and both my Republican, I happen to be, I think I'm the only Democrat up here, but I happen to be the Democratic commissioner, and my Republican commissioner and I both agreed that we really liked the poll books. In fact, they turned it into a gatekeeper system, so we can use them as gatekeeping systems because they printed up receipts for people that were at the wrong polling place. And in New York, if you're at the wrong polling place, your ballot doesn't count. So it told them where to go to the right polling place. But one of the things that we would love if electronic poll books were to go live in New York State is that signature captures. We could capture signatures right at the polling place, and people's signatures change over time. So we can get their most up-to-date signature, but history as well. We won't have to spend days scanning in every poll book that we have to give history to the voters. It's an automatic upload right when the poll books come back. That's a great suggestion about leasing laptops, because that was one of the big concerns about was this upfront cost of, we have 182 poll sites in Onondaga County. Are we going to buy 182 laptops that are going to be obsolete in a year? Right. So that's a wonderful solution to that problem. But, you know, obviously when we look at electronic poll books in New York, I think, unfortunately, they've been tied to early voting as that they're not beneficial unless we have early voting. And sometimes I think some of the opponents of early voting don't want poll books because it might lead to early voting. But there's so many benefits to electronic poll books that are not part of early voting that could help our boards get into the 21st century,
Transaction time is faster.
Yeah, and I think, and just having a full county database, it will reduce the number of affidavit ballots because we'll be able to know where they're supposed to go or whether they need to come down and get a court order. And it'll reduce the number of phone calls on election day because our election inspectors will be able to give them information as opposed to say, hey, call the board. So I'm a big advocate of electronic poll books. Our organization, the Elections Commissioner Association, this year added to our priority list to allow for counties who want to use it to be able to use it as a matter of record, to have electronic poll books. We're still waiting on the legislature on that, but there's a couple of bills being carried by both parties, so we're hopeful on that as well.
I've got a question on same-day registration. Well, actually, there's several questions. For same-day registration, can you do it for both the primary and the general election? Yes. And can and the other question is, do you guys have open primaries? Or how do people pick parties?
Right.
And how does that particularly work in the primary situation?
We don't have completely open primaries. Our current law right now is that unaffiliated voters can come in to a polling place or our office up until 7 o'clock on election night and declare a party. And so that's how if they want to participate, they just have to declare a party. They can go back to unaffiliated the next day. So if you're a member of if you're a Republican and you want to vote in the Democratic primary, then you have to change your party affiliation 29 days before the election. But for unaffiliated, they have that ability right up until election night to declare. We do have. We're looking at some initiatives on our ballot in November that call for a completely open primary. So I'm not, we'll have to see what happens with that. I do know, there's been some casework in other states that say completely open primaries are not legal. So, it'll be, it's going to be very interesting in Colorado, just like it is here in terms of what that looks like over the next few years.
And another question, and this is kind of more of an inside baseball wonky type of question. Federal law requires a statewide voter registration database. So how does your county, work with the statewide database, and how seamless is that? And I mean, are there issues there? New York State is a little bit different. We decided to go from like a bottom up, and most states started from a top down. So can you kind of talk a little bit some of the issues there? And electronic poll books and, keeping everything up to date?
Well, I was Secretary of State when that bill was passed, that law was passed at the federal level. And because we check our initiative petitions and petitions of candidates for statewide and above for petitions for candidates at the Secretary of State's office, and I was constantly in court over petitions for the initiatives, I chose, and my clerks did not like it. Matt was working for me at the time, so he can verify that, but I chose to do top down. So our system is built where the counties, it's immediate information from the counties up to the Secretary of State's office, and that way it's always updated. Because what we dealt with is we had records from our counties and they would send them in monthly. I was always at least 2 weeks behind, if not a month. And that period of people changing addresses or changing their party affiliation, that drove us crazy because we were never current and never up to date. Really, the reason our success of where we're at today in our voting is because we build it top down. So I was lucky. And the clerks love it now because they couldn't do what they're doing unless it was live information going to the Secretary of State's office, flowing back and forth. Sometimes you have to take heat to get someplace that you think is really important.
I just wanted to, voter turnout is most people are preoccupied with that, and you feel that
none of what you did had any impact on voter turnout? And if no, what would you do is there anything that you contemplate doing to improve voter turnout?
As Matt says, our voter turnout is high in Colorado. Maybe that's one of the reasons why this didn't change our voter impact.
What is your voter turnout?
Well, it usually runs between,
For presidentials, in terms of our active voter count, we're usually between 92 and 94%. Total eligibles, I think we were in the 60s, 65% in 2014. So
that's where you started.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There wasn't much.
An enviable place.
So, because our inactives, most of the time, they're not there. They're gone. So and that changes from time to time, and it's getting less. Our inactives are getting less in the future because of our clean rolls. And so that's important too, because we're doing our address changes so often, we're getting where people move out of state, so we can send that letter and get them off of our rolls if they are moving out of state.
The Secretary of State's office a few years ago really did targeted mailings to people that are eligible but not registered. And that mailing, while it helped a little bit, didn't move the needle all that much. I think what we're realizing is there's a segment of the population that for whatever reason, be it apathy, issues with trust in government, whatever the reason is, choose not to participate. And I think there'll always be that certain segment there. As much as we'd like to get them into the process, they just have no desire. And again, could be a whole host of reasons for that, but.
Well, but on the turnout issue, I mean, I don't know. I don't think that their experience is unusual, because other studies have shown the same effect, that you don't get the increase in turnout. It's just not there. I mean, you can change the voting pattern. It's just you can have that technology or change it. It's not increasing turnout. So, I mean, that goes to one of the issues that I have certainly raised in things that I've testified at, is technology is not always the answer. And what I hear is a lot of technological answers that try to address what I think is essentially a human problem. So I don't know that we've figured out that technology is the answer, because, as I say, it's not necessarily increasing the turnout. Now, the one question I do have on that vein is, do you rely upon a single vendor to provide these answers? Are these systems that are developed in-house? And they're not that old, so they're still within what would you term your usable life. So, and again, you said you invested a great deal of money in that, and as New York did with its own voting systems and its upgrade to its statewide voter registration database, what is the plan for that, and how's that gonna age and go forward?
There's been, first, just getting back to, and that's absolutely right. There is no, there doesn't seem to be across the board any demonstrable change by that. But what we found, though, again, it gets back to convenience for our voters. We're hearing that all the time. Voters all over the country saying they want shorter lines. And there is no question that it is the most cost-effective, the mail ballot model is the most cost-effective model. So that's why it works so well. In terms of our statewide e-poll book that was built in-house, Donetta kicked that off while she was still our Secretary of State's office. Our secretary now is having conversations about, we've had it now for almost 10 years. So any piece of software, they'll say the shelf life is about 10 years. So we're starting to look at what the next iteration of that looks like. We're not too far, at least that I'm privy to, too far down the road in terms of what that looks like. In terms of our voting system, Colorado just went through a process to select one voter, a uniform voting system for the entire state. So the idea is that by the year 2020, all the counties in our state will be on the same technology. The way that we did that was actually a really good process, where for the 2015 election, the Secretary of State's office did an RFP and Donetta was on that. She was on that selection committee. They did an RFP where vendors were able to put in bids, competitive bids. 4 vendors were chosen from all the vendors that originally submitted to go out and do pilots in Colorado. So it was a really unique situation where we as election administrators got to see how these programs, how the software worked out in the field as opposed to hypothetical just going through a test run. It was a really good process, a really robust process, and ultimately in December the secretary made a decision on the vendor that we're all going to move forward with. And you know, that most counties are excited about that. It certainly creates it's a better experience for our voters if they move from one county to another. The ballot and the accessible voting device, everything is going to have the same look to it, the same touch and feel to it. It'll help counties in terms of training. We don't have to go back to the vendor now and get charged on a per hour basis. If we just have a new employee and we need to get them trained, we can go to the county right next door and say, hey, can you help us out? They'll train us up. So right now, at the beginning of this process, most of the counties are excited about it. You know, and then we'll come back in 8 years and tell you what we think, you know, after 8 years with it. But, you know, right now people seem to be excited.
Thank you for your presentation. Can you talk a little bit more about the voting centers and what was the process? Did you eliminate some poll sites, and how did the people react to that, and how you got to where you're at?
Sure. We did. We went from about 200 locations down to 32 in 2012. This year we'll have 25 of those locations. By and large, the public really liked the convenience of being able to go wherever. You know, if they work downtown and they get off at 5 o'clock and they have to drive 20 miles to get to their polling place through traffic, there's a chance they wouldn't make it. Whereas if there was a vote center that was only 5 miles from their work, they could stop there and cast a ballot on the way home. So they love the convenience of it. The vote center model is less expensive because you don't need as many resources, both in terms of people and supplies. We did have a couple of locations that got overcrowded on Election Day, and we did have campaigns sending people to a couple of locations, and that did cause a little bit of issue. But
it's like 4 years ago.
Right, but outside of that, by and large, people really liked the experience and being able to go wherever, and they always love the opportunity where, you know, we can save money. So.
That's a good segue to something I wanted to cover, was saving money. Because as legislative chair of my organization, the biggest concern, and for a while, NYSECA was actually against early voting on record, but now it's neutral. And one of the reasons it was against was, I think the original bill that was put in by then Speaker Silver was a one-size-fits-all bill that was very prohibitive for some of our smaller counties. But then I was talking to you, Matt, a little bit before this presentation, and you said that, you know, we are in New York State, our local counties bear a great deal of the cost of elections. And you said, while local counties in Colorado do as well, you do get a reimbursement from the state of 80 cents per ballot, and that's something I'd like to endorse right now for New York. You know, but in all reality, though, I think at some point we're going to have to, in New York State, look at how we fund our elections and not put all of this burden on local counties. And if we want to make this investment in democracy, and I think it is an investment in democracy, we need to put state funds to the local facilities as well, to be able to help with these technological advances and these conveniences to the voters, because it is a convenience to the voters. But, you know, as you said, 80 cents per ballot you get, but now your cost is only $2.40 or so for a mail-in ballot. That's a significant portion of what your ballot cost is, and you know, a third of your ballot cost. We would love for the state to pay a third of our costs. So that's something I think that we need to get across the New York State legislatures and the governor's office and the budgets as well.
Let me give you a hint on how I got that passed. Part of it is figure out how much of the ballot is statewide and congressional. And the portion that is their expense, the county is sharing, paying all of it. So if you could really develop a reason why you need the state to pay part of it, you can do that. I also could add in ours with the statewide initiative and referendums. And that was, why was the counties having to pay for that portion of the ballot? Sometimes it meant that you had to go to a 2-page ballot. You have big issues with your judges at certain times, all the different judges on there, and so that creates more ballot types. Is that my understanding? You all help me.
Well, we often have districts where the Supreme Court judges take up a lot of the ballot, and it does vary district to district. So, yeah, that can happen.
So, add that into your reasoning, that why is the counties paying for all of this state cost of the ballot and do a portion of the share. That's how we got that through.
The other thing we do too is we also build down ballot. So municipalities that have questions or candidates on our ballot, we'll send them a bill as well.
Yeah, just to go back a minute on, what you said, Donetta, about creating your statewide database. You did a top-down. I was here when we did ours, and New York comes from a place, and I don't really know Colorado's history very well, frankly, but New York comes from a place where home rule is very strong in this state. Counties have a very strong presence in New York State.
Are they home rule also? Your counties? Are your counties home rule also?
Well, they're home rule in the sense that they have a great deal of autonomy in New York State.
Okay.
Our state government was built that way. For example, all of our welfare social services programs are run on the county level.
Sure,
they're not run
ours are
state
too.
level. So it's very much a state that is built around the county governments as being a very strong part of our state. So when we were engaged in building a statewide database like you were, the idea of a top-down just was not acceptable, largely because of our history. It's where bottom-up was always the way it ran, and there was a great reluctance to invade that type of program in this state. That goes to the funding, issue as well. You're right. The state government virtually gives no money at all to our localities for election purposes. The only outside money I think our localities ever got was the federal money that came in for the new machines, and that was all federal. So it's historical in New York that we give the counties autonomy. Our database is still driven by the counties. Our elections are still run by the counties. The state has virtually no role in actually running elections in this state. So it's a historical thing as much as anything. But it does impact what we can do and how we do business. There's no question, because you're right, creating a statewide program isn't as easy because you don't have a statewide system. Like you talked about the delay in getting voter registrations uploaded to your state system because it's done from the bottom up. So, there are issues that come up, but again, just speaking historically, this is where we come from. And again, I don't know if Colorado has a history like this. I'm not sure what it is as far as the county role in your governmental system.
Yeah, it's very much the same, and I took a great deal of heat when I did the top-down. The counties were not happy that that's the way we chose to do it. But in giving the reasons and always being in court, it drew the counties into court also. So they begin to understand it. And now, obviously, we have new county clerks because we're term limited in Colorado. You can get out of the term limit, but the clerks even are term limited. So they're all passed, and now they know it's top down and really don't fight it at all. But, originally, yes, they gave it a problem, or gave it a great deal of issue. But, doing it then, it's very difficult for New York now. If you changed that, it would be a tremendous, I don't know if you could get it done.
I don't know if we could either in the context of having elections occurring while you're trying to do this.
Right.
You're right. Transitioning from one system to another is very difficult because your time is so limited. We just had an election, I don't know when yours was, but we had one on the 19th, presidential. We're going to have another primary in late June. We're going to have another primary in September. We're going to have a general election in November. The amount of time between elections is very, very limited. So you're right, to try to transition your election system in the context of an upcoming election is not always practical.
So one of the things that we heard in relation to the April 19th primary was exactly this gap between when things were being recorded at the county level on the voter rolls and when it then got up to the state level. So what we heard was the voters were checking the online presence, which is the state level, which is a phenomenal service to the voters, but it wasn't the same as the county records. So you would have voters getting to the polling place with an expectation based on what they had just checked at home the night before, and it wasn't actually what was in the voter rolls. And I guess my question is, how can we shrink the gap so that voter expectation is closer, the data is more accurate, so voter expectation is better, so that we don't have 50 or 60 people standing at the Board of Elections in New York City, all of whom want to yell about the fact that, well, I checked online and it told me that X, Y, and Z, and then I got to the polling place and they told me something different.
I think, I'm sorry, I think actually the gap was even more pronounced during this election because we had a huge influx of people registering at the DMV and the My DMV, and then that would come down to the county level, and then we would, confirm it, input it, and then it would go up to the state level. So it was even another step, and so where they're thinking something is instantaneous and that it's coming about right away, and there's actually several steps to that.
And I think, are we being shortened here?
Not at all.
Okay, I just wanted to, another issue we've got is, different counties have different systems.
Right.
So you don't always deal with the same system across the state. For example, New York City has their own system. Yes. A number of our counties use a certain vendor. So you do have some consistency there, but then you're dealing with New York City, which does its own voter registration system, wholly contained within the city of New York. So when you're trying to work on at the state level, you're trying to work on a process that will do what you're suggesting, which is upload information timely, which is clearly a concern of ours, and making sure that our information is accurate and is current. We have to do that on several different platforms, depending on which county we're dealing with. So it is a challenge. There's no question. And this idea of a decentralized government does create its challenges. There's no question. But again, that's something that was created back in, when did we create those, Donetta? 2004?
After 2002.
Yeah, it was after 2. So, mid-2000s. To try to change that now just isn't practical, and so we work with it as best we can. But there are some times when this delay can present a problem.
Right, and hopefully as things are upgraded, that there are better what the techies call APIs to allow these different systems to talk to each other. But I know it's an ongoing struggle.
Well, and added to that ongoing struggle is social media and in non-official databases that were out there telling people to go to old polling places that were maybe polling places a year ago or 2 years ago. We had a large amount of people who said that they checked Google where their polling place was, or they checked another type of app that was not our system, and they were told the wrong polling place, and they were mad at us that they got wrong information from a accredited site. So I think that adds to the confusion for voters as well, and it's a challenge when we're talking about doing online registration and all of this other stuff, that all these other things that are out there that are creating confusion doesn't help.
We have time for one more question. Yes, please. Oh.
I haven't heard anything about the quality of the voting, the information that the voters are using in order to vote. And just anecdotally, I noticed that when I was visiting my daughter in Colorado, that she and her husband were going through all your propositions or whatever they are, and actually doing some research in order to vote, which I thought was pretty amazing, because I know I've gotten into the election booth and went,
oh, I forgot, and I wouldn't vote for something because I'd forgotten to do my research. And have you found any of this as far as the other, I mean, these are two people. Have you gotten any input from other voters that they feel more informed about the issues?
Well, let me start with our initiatives and referendums. That statewide, they are vetted at the Legislative Council, and it's nonpartisan. It's an open process with the public involved, and setting the title, even from setting the title on down to the pros and cons. And they send out a booklet every election on the pros and cons of the issues. So it's a very open process, and thank goodness the county clerks don't have to do that one. They do have to do, they do have to do the locals, and each local has to do their pro and con, but they send it to the county clerk and recorder, and they put the booklet together for local issues, but they don't set the pros and cons. It's set by the individual entity, whether it's a special district, school district, municipality. They do their own with their process, but it's all open processes setting that. So I think the voters feel like they're really being educated on that portion of the ballot. As far as candidates go, our different organizations, they interview candidates and set up, who they're supporting and who they're not. They get some information there. And we also have our judges. That is vetted. If a judge does a very poor job, they're recommended not to be put back into that position. So there is a lot of information, but I will tell you also the county clerks developed their own website to educate the voters on this new election process so they could look up where they go vote and all that information. And Common Cause, League of Women Voters all put out that information, linked it to our website where voters knew where they were voting, where there was drop-off boxes. The information was there, the hours that each one of them were open, if it was a 24-hour drop-off box, whatever the case was in any county, the voters had that information. We did that individually on our own. Now we've asked the Secretary of State to take that website over and house it, but the counties really develop it and send the information to the Secretary. And they keep it up just so we didn't have to continue paying for it because we didn't have that kind of funds.
Do you think having the ballot ahead of time helps the voters? Because I think the part of what you were talking about was that people would go into the election day here in New York, and that's when they would see a referendum. They may not know about it, but getting those ballots 22 days ahead of time gives them an opportunity to check these referendums and make a decision on it.
That's correct. I mean, not only is information in the paper about the pros and cons and ballot issues that's going to be on the ballot, but they could sit at their table with their ballot and then the pro and con manual and make their decisions how they want to vote. It takes our voters in the polling place between 20 and 30 minutes to vote because we have so many issues on our ballot. So we're talking about day and night, what you guys have. We had to go to other capabilities of our voters voting. Yeah, I mean, it's a problem. We couldn't furnish that much equipment into our counties and polling places to handle the voters when it takes them this length of time to vote, because the initiative process really caught on, and we didn't have, sometimes we have 12 issues on the ballot. And they're long to read them, and so it's very time-consuming for our voters, and we had to be able to move forward and give them opportunities of voting other than Election Day.
Donetta, thank you. Mr. Czarny, no more anarchy. There are no more questions allowed. I personally have found this to be probably the most informative and interesting hour and a half I have ever spent. And I think it's due not only to the expertise which has come here, but also the sharply focused questions from our group here who obviously are familiar with and are concerned about making a better system here in the state. So the sweet part is that our hosts, the Rockefeller Institute, Common Cause, and the League are hosting a modest reception outside where we can mix it up even a little more informally. And thank you again for what a wonderful program.